2 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my wedding planner ran into the bridal suite and whispered something that made my entire world stop. I remember the exact moment because everything about that morning had felt perfect until then. The sunlight was coming through the tall windows of the bridal suite at the Harborview Hotel in Boston, turning the white curtains almost golden. My bridesmaids were laughing while helping each other with earrings and heels, and someone had just opened a bottle of sparkling cider so we could toast before the ceremony. I had spent a full year planning that day. Every detail mattered to me, from the pale ivory roses in my bouquet to the small jazz trio that was supposed to play during the cocktail hour. My fiancé Daniel and I had chosen the venue carefully, overlooking the water, because we both loved the harbor and wanted something that felt calm and elegant. Everything had been confirmed weeks in advance. Every contract signed. Every vendor paid. So when Megan, my wedding planner, stepped inside the room and quietly asked if she could speak with me alone, I thought maybe there was a small scheduling issue or a delivery running late. Instead, she closed the door behind her, her face pale in a way I had never seen before, and said something that didn't make sense at first. She told me the florist had canceled. The bakery had canceled. The band had canceled. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence, convinced she was about to say they were delayed or stuck in traffic or bringing replacements. But she didn't. She just stood there holding a tablet in her hands, like she didn't know how to explain what she was seeing. I actually laughed for a second because the idea was so ridiculous. Vendors don't just cancel a wedding the morning of the ceremony, especially not 3 of them at the same time. There must be some kind of mistake, I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. Megan hesitated before showing me the screen. On it were 3 separate confirmation messages from the vendors, all saying the same thing. According to them, the bride had contacted them the previous evening and told them the wedding was no longer happening. I felt my stomach drop instantly. That's impossible, I said. I never contacted anyone. Megan nodded slowly, as if she had expected that answer. She tapped one of the emails open and turned the tablet toward me. The message looked simple and direct, written as if it had come from me. It said the wedding plans had changed and the services were no longer needed. At the bottom was my name typed neatly as the sender. But the email address wasn't mine. It was one I had never seen before. And then Megan said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller. The vendors hadn't just received emails. They had also received phone calls confirming the cancellation. And every single one of them said the same thing about the woman who called. She introduced herself as the bride's mother. For a few seconds I could not respond at all. I simply stared at Megan, trying to process the sentence she had just spoken. The bride's mother. My mind refused to connect the words to the person I knew. My mother, Linda Carter, had been in the hotel since early that morning. I had seen her less than an hour earlier walking through the lobby with a garment bag over her arm, greeting relatives who had flown in from Ohio and Pennsylvania for the weekend. She had hugged me when I arrived at the bridal suite and told me I looked beautiful even before I had finished my hair and makeup. Nothing about her behavior had seemed strange. Nothing had hinted that something like this was happening behind the scenes. I shook my head slowly and told Megan there had to be some misunderstanding because my mother would never cancel the wedding vendors without telling me. Megan did not argue, but the expression on her face suggested that the vendors had sounded very certain. She explained that the florist had first noticed something unusual the night before when an email arrived asking to cancel the flower arrangements. Because it was already late in the evening, the florist had tried calling the number listed in the contract for confirmation. Instead of reaching me, the call had been answered by a woman who calmly introduced herself as Linda, the bride's mother, and explained that the wedding plans had changed and the flowers were no longer needed. According to the florist, the woman sounded confident and completely sure of what she was saying. The bakery reported the exact same situation early that morning. A phone call had come in just after 8 o'clock asking them to stop delivery of the 3-tier wedding cake we had ordered months earlier. The caller again identified herself as the bride's mother and told them the event had been cancelled. The jazz trio had received a similar message just before 9. 3 different vendors. 3 different conversations. All of them claiming that my mother had contacted them personally. I felt my hands beginning to tremble as the pieces started to settle into place. My mother had never been excited about my marriage to Daniel. She had never openly tried to stop it, but there had always been a certain tension in the way she spoke about him. She would ask careful questions about his job and his family and then quietly remind me that marriage was a serious decision that could change the rest of my life. At the time I thought she was simply being protective. She had raised me alone after my father passed away when I was in college, and I understood that she worried about me. But standing there in that quiet bridal suite with my wedding dress hanging beside the mirror and guests beginning to arrive downstairs, a new possibility slowly crept into my thoughts. If the vendors were telling the truth, then someone had been working behind my back to dismantle the most important day of my life piece by piece, and the only name any of them remembered hearing was my mother's. The room felt strangely quiet after Megan finished explaining what the vendors had told her. Outside the bridal suite I could still hear the distant sounds of the hotel preparing for the ceremony downstairs. Plates clinking in the ballroom. Staff members moving chairs across the polished floor. Guests arriving earlier than expected. It should have been the happiest morning of my life, yet suddenly everything felt fragile, like the entire day was balanced on a single thread that could snap at any moment. I walked slowly toward the window and looked down at the harbor. Small boats were moving across the water under the bright late morning sun, completely unaware that my wedding was quietly falling apart upstairs. I asked Megan if there was any chance the vendors had misunderstood the calls, but she gently shook her head and explained that each of them had double-checked before canceling their deliveries. The florist had even asked the caller twice whether the cancellation was confirmed, and the woman had repeated calmly that the event was no longer taking place. Hearing that detail made my chest tighten. My mother had always been calm when she made decisions. That was one of the things people admired about her. She never raised her voice and she never appeared uncertain. When she believed she was right about something, she moved forward with quiet confidence. Standing there in my wedding robe, I suddenly remembered several small moments from the past few months that had seemed harmless at the time but now felt different. A few weeks earlier my mother had asked for the contact information of the florist, saying she wanted to send them a few ideas for the table arrangements. Another time she had asked what bakery we were using because she wanted to confirm the delivery time so our family could arrive early and help set up. I had given her those details without thinking twice because she had always been deeply involved in planning family events. Even during my college graduation party years ago she had coordinated the decorations and catering herself. But now those memories felt less like helpful curiosity and more like preparation. I turned back toward Megan and asked her if the vendors had mentioned anything else about the woman who called. Megan hesitated for a moment before answering. She said the florist remembered the caller speaking very politely but with a tone that suggested she was completely certain the wedding was a mistake that needed to be corrected. Those words echoed in my mind because they sounded exactly like something my mother might say. She had never insulted Daniel directly, but she often hinted that I deserved someone with a more stable career or a more traditional lifestyle. Daniel was a high school history teacher who loved his job and cared deeply about his students, but my mother sometimes described teaching as a temporary career rather than a long-term future. At the time I had brushed those comments aside, believing that once she saw how happy we were together she would eventually accept the marriage. Now, standing in the quiet bridal suite with the ceremony only 2 hours away, a heavier realization slowly settled over me. If the vendors had truly spoken with my mother, then she had not simply been asking questions about the wedding plans. She had been actively trying to stop the entire day from happening. For a moment I did not move. I stood in the middle of the bridal suite with Megan's tablet still glowing in my hands while my thoughts tried to catch up with the reality unfolding around me. Somewhere down the hallway one of my bridesmaids laughed at something, completely unaware that half of our wedding plans had just disappeared. I slowly set the tablet down on the dressing table beside my bouquet and tried to breathe normally. The scent of the ivory roses filled the room, soft and familiar, yet suddenly everything felt distant, as if I were watching my own life from the outside. Megan gently asked what I wanted to do next. It was a simple question, but the answer felt impossible. Confronting my mother immediately would create a scene only hours before the ceremony, and the last thing I wanted was chaos spreading through the hotel while guests were still arriving. But ignoring the situation did not feel possible either. If the vendors truly believed the wedding had been cancelled, we might be standing in a beautifully decorated venue with no cake, no flowers for the ceremony, and no music for the reception. I closed my eyes for a moment and forced myself to think calmly the way my mother always had during difficult moments. The first step was understanding exactly how much damage had already been done. I asked Megan whether any of the vendors had completely withdrawn or if there was still a chance to correct the misunderstanding. She quickly began checking her messages and calling the florist again. While she spoke quietly near the door, I sat down in front of the mirror where my makeup artist had finished my hair earlier that morning. The reflection staring back at me looked like a bride ready for a perfect ceremony, yet inside I felt the slow unraveling of something much larger than a simple scheduling problem. As I sat there, another memory surfaced from the night before during the rehearsal dinner. My mother had seemed unusually quiet throughout the evening. While everyone else laughed and shared stories about Daniel and me, she had spent much of the dinner studying the table decorations and asking subtle questions about the next day's schedule. At the time I assumed she was simply nervous about the ceremony because she had always been protective of me. But now the memory felt different. I remembered one moment when Daniel's sister had complimented the florist's arrangements and my mother had responded with a polite smile before saying something that had seemed harmless at the time. She had said that weddings often look beautiful on the outside but sometimes hide decisions that people regret later. Everyone had laughed politely, assuming she was joking, but I now realized that her words had carried a meaning none of us had understood. Megan ended the phone call and walked back toward me with a slightly hopeful expression. She explained that the florist had not yet delivered the arrangements and was willing to continue if the cancellation had truly been a mistake. The bakery was still reachable as well, although the driver had paused the delivery truck until the situation was clarified. Hearing that gave me a small sense of relief, but the deeper questions still remained unanswered. Someone had tried to dismantle my wedding piece by piece, and the only person connected to every cancelled vendor was the woman who had raised me. I remained seated in front of the mirror for another moment, listening to the quiet movements in the room around me while Megan continued contacting the vendors. My reflection looked calm, almost composed, but inside my thoughts were moving quickly through every possibility. If my mother truly believed canceling the wedding would somehow protect me, she must have convinced herself that she was doing the right thing. That realization made the situation even more unsettling. My mother had always believed that she understood what was best for my life. Growing up, she had guided every major decision I made, from the college I attended to the first apartment I rented after graduation. She had done it out of love, or at least that was how I had always interpreted it. But now I wondered if that same certainty had pushed her into interfering with something that should have belonged entirely to me. Megan finished another call and told me that the bakery was willing to continue with the cake delivery as long as we confirmed the event was still happening. Hearing those words gave me a small wave of relief. The wedding had not collapsed yet. There was still time to repair the damage before the ceremony began. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door of the bridal suite, feeling the soft fabric of my robe brush against the floor with each step. Through the slightly open doorway I could hear my bridesmaids chatting in the hallway about the decorations downstairs. None of them had any idea that the day had nearly been dismantled before it even began. Megan asked quietly if I wanted her to continue handling the vendors while I spoke with my mother, but I hesitated. Confronting her without understanding everything could turn the situation into an emotional argument that would only create more confusion. Instead, I asked Megan one more question. I wanted to know whether any of the vendors had kept a record of the calls they received. She nodded and said that the florist had mentioned a voicemail message confirming the cancellation. That detail made my stomach tighten again. A voicemail meant there would be proof of the voice on the other end of the call. Megan promised she would try to obtain the recording while continuing to restore the contracts. While she stepped outside to make another call, I remained in the quiet room and looked once more at the harbor through the tall window. Boats moved slowly across the water, their white wakes cutting clean lines through the blue surface. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of view Daniel and I had imagined when we first chose this venue together. That memory steadied me. No matter what had happened earlier that morning, I knew why we were here. Daniel was waiting downstairs with his family, believing that in a few hours we would begin the next chapter of our lives together. The thought of disappointing him or allowing someone else to control that moment filled me with a new sense of determination. If my mother had truly attempted to stop the wedding, then I needed to understand why. And more importantly, I needed to decide what kind of boundaries would exist between her choices and my future. The quiet determination that had begun to settle in my chest stayed with me as I stepped out of the bridal suite and into the hallway. The carpeted corridor of the Harborview Hotel was already filling with the low hum of arriving guests and distant conversations drifting up from the ballroom below. My bridesmaids were gathered near the elevator, laughing softly while checking their phones and adjusting their dresses. When they saw me, they smiled warmly, completely unaware that only minutes earlier the entire wedding had nearly been dismantled behind the scenes. I returned their smiles and told them everything was under control, because in that moment I realized something important. If my mother had tried to stop this wedding quietly, she was counting on confusion and panic to finish the job. She was expecting the day to unravel before anyone had time to understand what was happening. But the ceremony was still scheduled. The guests were still arriving. Daniel was still waiting downstairs believing that our wedding day was unfolding exactly as planned. And I had no intention of letting someone else decide the outcome of a day we had spent a year preparing. I walked slowly toward the balcony at the end of the hallway where the tall windows overlooked the harbor. From there I could see the outdoor terrace where the ceremony chairs had already been arranged in neat rows facing the water. Staff members were placing programs on the seats while the sound technician tested the microphone near the arch where Daniel and I would soon stand. The scene looked exactly the way we had imagined it when we first toured the venue months earlier. Seeing that steadied me. Whatever had happened earlier that morning had not destroyed the wedding yet. It had only revealed something I needed to understand. A moment later Megan approached from behind, holding her phone with a focused expression. She told me the florist had agreed to continue the delivery and the bakery truck was already back on its way to the hotel. The jazz trio had also confirmed they would arrive before the reception began. Hearing that felt like watching pieces of the day slowly return to their places. But Megan had one more update. The florist had sent the voicemail recording she mentioned earlier. Megan explained that she had listened to it briefly before coming upstairs. The message was short and polite, confirming that the wedding services were no longer required. And although Megan did not want to jump to conclusions, she said the voice on the recording sounded very similar to the woman she had seen earlier that morning greeting guests in the lobby. My mother. I stood quietly for a moment as the realization settled into place with complete clarity. The evidence was no longer just speculation or second-hand reports from vendors. Somewhere in that hotel there was a recording of my mother calmly canceling the services for my wedding. Instead of feeling panic, I felt an unexpected calm begin to spread through my thoughts. My mother had always believed she could guide the course of my life from behind the scenes. But this time the truth was beginning to surface in ways she could not control, and the day was far from over. I stood there on the balcony for a long moment after Megan finished speaking, letting the quiet sound of the harbor settle my thoughts. The breeze coming off the water carried the faint scent of salt and summer air, and somewhere below I could hear the soft murmur of guests beginning to gather near the ceremony terrace. The day was continuing whether I felt ready or not. That realization gave me clarity. I asked Megan to send the voicemail recording to my phone. She hesitated for a moment, perhaps worried about what hearing it might do to me so close to the ceremony, but then she nodded and forwarded the message. A few seconds later my phone vibrated in my hand. The file was only 20 seconds long. I stared at the screen before pressing play, suddenly aware that once I heard the voice on that recording, there would be no more uncertainty about what had happened. The message began with a brief pause and then a calm, familiar voice spoke clearly into the line. The woman politely introduced herself as the bride's mother and explained that the wedding arrangements needed to be cancelled immediately. She thanked the florist for their work and said the change in plans had been necessary because her daughter had made a mistake she was trying to correct. The tone was composed, almost reassuring, the same voice I had heard my entire life offering advice and guidance during difficult decisions. But hearing those words in that context felt completely different. There was no anger in the message, no raised voice, no sign of hesitation. It was simply my mother calmly dismantling my wedding plans one vendor at a time. When the recording ended I lowered the phone slowly, feeling an unexpected calm settle over me again. The truth was no longer hidden behind rumors or misunderstandings. It was recorded clearly in her own voice. Megan watched my expression carefully as I looked back out at the harbor. She asked quietly if I wanted her to confront my mother with the recording or if I preferred to handle the situation privately. I thought about the dozens of guests already arriving downstairs, people who had traveled hundreds of miles to celebrate this day with Daniel and me. Creating a dramatic argument in the middle of the hotel lobby would only bring more chaos into a situation that was finally beginning to stabilize. Instead, I told Megan to continue restoring the vendors and preparing the ceremony exactly as planned. The wedding would move forward. Daniel and our guests deserved that much. But I also knew something else with complete certainty now. My mother had made her move believing she could quietly change the course of my life without being questioned. What she did not realize was that the truth had already surfaced, and before the day ended she would have to face it. I slipped the phone back into my hand and took a slow breath while the harbor wind moved softly across the balcony. The truth was now sitting quietly in my pocket, recorded in my mother's own voice, and somehow that knowledge steadied me instead of shaking me. Inside the hotel the day was continuing to unfold. I could hear footsteps in the hallway and the distant music of a violinist warming up downstairs. Guests were arriving with wrapped gifts and cameras, expecting to witness a joyful ceremony by the water. None of them knew that only an hour earlier the entire wedding had almost disappeared before it even began. Megan returned from another call and confirmed that the florist was already on the way with the arrangements. The bakery truck had also checked in at the loading dock, and the musicians had promised they would be setting up their instruments within the next 30 minutes. Piece by piece the wedding was rebuilding itself. I felt a quiet gratitude toward the vendors who had chosen to trust Megan's explanation and continue with the event instead of walking away from the confusion. Their willingness to help meant that Daniel and I would still have the ceremony we had planned, even if the morning had started with uncertainty. As Megan stepped away again to coordinate the final details, I remained by the balcony and watched the guests gathering near the terrace chairs below. Families were greeting one another, hugging relatives they had not seen in years, and pointing their phones toward the harbor view. The scene looked exactly the way a wedding should look. Joyful. Anticipated. Hopeful. And somewhere within that crowd my mother was standing among them, greeting people with the same calm smile she always wore during family gatherings. The thought no longer filled me with confusion. Instead it gave me a strange sense of clarity. My mother believed she had quietly corrected what she thought was a mistake in my life. She had acted behind the scenes with the confidence of someone who believed her judgment mattered more than my choices. But she had not expected the day to continue moving forward without her control. I turned away from the window and walked slowly back through the hallway toward the bridal suite. My bridesmaids were still chatting softly, adjusting ribbons on the bouquets that had just arrived from the florist. The sight of the flowers filled the room with fresh fragrance and renewed energy. One of my friends smiled at me and asked if everything was ready downstairs. I nodded and told her the ceremony would begin exactly on schedule. As I sat once more in front of the mirror, the soft ivory dress hanging beside me reflected in the glass like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. I knew that within the next hour I would walk down the aisle toward Daniel and begin the life we had chosen together. And before the day ended, the truth about what had happened that morning would no longer remain hidden behind polite smiles and quiet conversations. I stood in the bridal suite as the final minutes before the ceremony slowly slipped by, listening to the quiet rhythm of preparations continuing throughout the hotel. The florist arrived with the arrangements just as Megan had promised, carrying buckets of pale ivory roses that filled the room with the same soft fragrance I had imagined months earlier when Daniel and I first chose them together. My bridesmaids carefully arranged the bouquets while the stylist adjusted the train of my dress, and for the first time that morning everything finally felt the way a wedding morning should feel. Calm. Anticipated. Real. When Megan returned, she gave me a small reassuring nod and said that every vendor had confirmed their services again. The cake had arrived safely, the musicians were tuning their instruments near the terrace, and guests were already beginning to take their seats facing the water. Hearing those words allowed me to release the tension I had been carrying since the morning began. The wedding was no longer at risk. The day had survived. A few minutes later, one of the coordinators knocked gently on the door to tell us the ceremony would begin soon. My bridesmaids gathered around me, smoothing the fabric of my gown and offering quiet smiles that reminded me why they had traveled so far to be here. As we stepped into the hallway together, the distant sound of the violin grew clearer, drifting up from the terrace like a gentle signal that the moment had arrived. I walked slowly toward the staircase that led down to the ceremony space, each step bringing the harbor view closer into sight through the tall glass windows. When I reached the entrance to the terrace, I paused briefly and saw Daniel standing at the front beside the officiant, his posture calm but his eyes searching the aisle with anticipation. Seeing him there erased the last trace of doubt from my thoughts. This was the life we had chosen together, and no quiet interference could undo that truth. The music shifted to the processional and the guests rose from their seats, turning toward the aisle as I stepped forward into the sunlight. My mother was seated in the second row among relatives and family friends, wearing the same composed expression she had shown all morning. For a moment our eyes met, and I wondered whether she realized how close her plan had come to succeeding. But the ceremony continued without interruption. I walked down the aisle, took Daniel's hands, and listened as the officiant began the words that would join our lives together. The harbor breeze moved gently across the terrace while our families and friends watched in quiet support. By the time we exchanged our vows, the morning's chaos felt distant, like something that belonged to another story entirely. Yet I knew the truth had not disappeared. The recording on my phone still existed, and before the evening ended my mother would understand that the choices shaping my future would no longer be hers to control. As Daniel and I walked back down the aisle together as husband and wife, surrounded by applause and the warm afternoon sunlight, I realized that the most important part of the day had never been the flowers or the music or the cake. It had been the simple fact that the wedding had gone forward anyway, proving that even quiet sabotage cannot stop a future built on two people choosing each other.